Hello and welcome again to this video, the fourth and final part looking at stories from the Quran's 18th chapter, Surat Al-Kahf, aka the chapter of the cave. This video will look at the origins of some of these stories, in particular over the adventures of a man called the Man with Two Horns, which in Arabic is Dhul Qarnayn. In the past couple of videos, I looked at Dhul Qarnayn's bizarre adventures in the Quran, where he sees the sun setting into a muddy spring, and later builds a huge barrier to keep out two huge and troublesome tribes called Gog and Magog. The Quran never named this man with two horns, and Muslims have argued ever since who this person with the two horns is. Some have concluded it is Alexander the Great, some say it's Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, while others prefer not to speculate altogether. I deliberately avoided referring to this in the past two videos as I felt it was important to try and focus on the absurdities of the stories themselves, and not get sidetracked into something less important. But digging deeper into the character of Dhul Qarnayn is very interesting in itself, as it once again shows us how stories, almost universally considered today as legends with barely any historical truth to them, made their way into the Quran and other Islamic texts. Having read the different versions of what remains of the Alexander Romance legends, some of which have been lost over time, I am in no doubt that the character of Dhul Qarnayn mentioned in the Quran was based on the legendary Alexander stories, made up by those who idolized him, not the historical Alexander or any other character. So, who was Alexander the Great? Well, in brief, he was a skilled Macedonian leader/general who managed to conquer much of the known world at the time, his empire eventually stretching from Egypt and Macedonia in the west to modern-day Pakistan and Tajikistan in the east. Born in 356 BC, Alexander was born into a life of privilege and even had Aristotle as his tutor. He revered Cyrus the Great to such an extent that upon conquering Persia, he began to embrace many cultural aspects of Persian life, as well as claiming divinity and ordering his subjects to bow down to him in ancient Persian fashion called proskinesis. Proskinesis was a Persian method of worship. Let me ask the Muslims watching this, does this look familiar? Except for the last stage of Persian proskinesis, with the entire body lying face down, it's pretty much exactly what Muslim prayers eventually became as well. Remember that next time you're in a mosque. You're simply seeing an ancient Persian ritual of worship, not something new and unique to Islam. Anyway, I digress. So, before setting out to conquer Asia, Alexander brought along the well-known historian of his era, Callisthenes of Olynthus. He wanted Callisthenes to record his exploits and the march of the Macedonian army east. But Alexander's attitude and growing arrogance were not always well received by the Macedonians around him. Callisthenes was one of those who came to despise much of Alexander's behavior, in particular his demand for others to worship him. Callisthenes was imprisoned until his death in 327 BC. His historical works were all but destroyed. 4 years later, Alexander died at the age of 32 in Babylon. Having won every single battle during his life, crushing a once giant Persian empire and creating the largest empire the world had ever seen at that stage in history, Alexander inevitably became a legend. Stories were created to portray him in an ever more flattering light almost immediately after his death, with tales of his adventures growing more and more spectacular as time progressed. But which came first? Did the Alexander Romance stories predate Islam, or was Islam first in revealing these stories? Historians have effectively reached a consensus that the Alexander Romance stories are effectively nothing more than fables falsely attributed to Callisthenes. They began circulating orally soon after Alexander's death. Hundreds of years later, these fables were written down in Greece and Egypt around 200 AD. Ernest Wallace Budge, a British Egyptologist and curator, writes the following in the History of Alexander the Great. The first book of the history of Alexander, according to Pseudo-Callisthenes, is certainly of Egyptian origin, and its birthplace was Alexandria. Colonel Yule places the composition of the work as far back as AD 200. But there is no doubt that the legends which are contained in it were current some hundreds of years before. Indeed, some of them must have been known within a few years of Alexander's death. The stories from these versions and the oral traditions led to more versions arriving. But given the geography and incredibly strong trade links in the region, if these myths were written down in Greece and Egypt by 200 AD, then the oral tradition would have almost certainly been very strong in Arabia by that time, and for a few hundred years later, long before Islam was born. Some Muslims may claim certain versions of the Alexander Romance were physically written down around the same time, or a little later than when the Quranic verses were revealed. That simply ignores the fact that there were many versions, and ignores the fact that the legends most likely began as folklore, and were well known to people through word of mouth before they were eventually written down. Even within Islam itself, the hadiths and the seerah were only written down a couple of hundred years after the stories and sayings allegedly occurred. We also saw in an earlier video how the Quran appears to borrow the idea of the sun setting into a muddy spring from a pre-Islamic poem by Tubba, as evidenced in early Islamic